The 26th of August, 1992. The morning papers had not yet reached the stands, but inside Buckingham Palace, the atmosphere already felt heavier than the leaden summer sky outside. A private secretary, a man whose name would never appear in any official history, had been summoned to the Prince Philip's study at precisely 7:15. The prince, already dressed in a crisp polo shirt and pressed trousers despite the early hour, did not look up from the document he was reading. The other man waited, the silence broken only by the ticking of a mahogany long-case clock. Eventually, Philip removed his reading glasses with the deliberation of a judge setting down a gavel. His voice, when it came, was not raised. It barely carried to the far side of the desk, yet each word landed like a stone dropped into still water. This family has survived a world war, a revolution in Russia, the abdication of a king. It will not be undone by a woman who cannot keep her toes out of the newspapers. He did not mention her name. He did not need to. That was the day the freeze began. Not a hot theatrical rage, but something far more terrifying, a cold, clinical calculation. The Duke of Edinburgh had looked at Sarah, Duchess of York, and reached a permanent verdict. She was no longer worth the breath it would take to speak her name. I'm Arthur Blackwood, and this is the Royal Archivist. Over the next 40 minutes or so, I'm going to take you into one of the most carefully constructed estrangements in modern royal history. Not a feud of explosive arguments, but a quarter-century of silence and carefully managed absence, a grudge so exact it required its own choreographed logistics. If you find the hidden machinery of the crown as fascinating as I do consider subscribing to this channel now, so you never miss a dispatch from the archives. Now, let us step back 30 years and ask the question that has echoed through drawing rooms and newspaper offices ever since. What exactly did Sarah Ferguson do? The short, tabloid version is a story everyone thinks they know. In the late spring of 1992, a palace machine already reeling from the serial disasters of what the Queen would later call an annus horribilis was dealt yet another blow. 4 years into her marriage to Prince Andrew, the Duchess of York had joined the Queen's traditional summer retreat, but not at Balmoral in the Highlands. She had gone to the Mediterranean, to the south of France. At a rented villa near Saint-Tropez, she was photographed by a paparazzo named Daniel Angeli, a specialist in entrapment who had stalked royal circles for years. The images showed Sarah sunbathing topless by a pool, and then, in the sequence that would detonate a scandal, a man named John Bryan, an American financial advisor, appeared to be sucking her toes. The photograph was published in the Daily Mirror on the morning of the 20th of August, and the press had its villainess. This was the common narrative: a vulgar, spendthrift duchess, caught in a sleazy act of infidelity, humiliating the prince she had married. The public believed that Prince Philip, that austere defender of royal dignity, must have exploded in a fury that never subsided. That official story has the shape of truth, but none of its core. The fury certainly existed. Courtiers who were present in the days after have spoken of a duke whose quiet, drawling voice carried a menace far beyond shouting. One equerry, speaking decades later under condition of anonymity, described the atmosphere in Philip's office as that of a man who had been personally struck. But the cartoon version, of a father-in-law raging at a wayward daughter-in-law in some televised shouting match, misses the entire nature of the man. Prince Philip did not bellow, he decided. And the decision he reached was not that Sarah Ferguson was a sinner to be castigated, it was that she was a liability to be erased. The two things are profoundly different, and they explain everything that followed. Let us strip away the tabloid myth and rebuild this story from the bricks of documented fact. The first thing to understand is the timing, because in the royal family, timing is never a coincidence. The toe-sucking photographs were not an isolated incident that landed in a calm sea. They arrived just 10 weeks after the publication of Andrew Morton's book, Diana, Her True Story. That book, with its devastating revelations about the Prince and Princess of Wales's private war, had fractured the public's trust in the monarchy on a scale not seen since the abdication of Edward VIII. The Queen was still absorbing the diplomatic fallout. The men in grey suits at the palace were in crisis mode, scrambling to manage the news cycle, and into this already toxic environment, Sarah Ferguson, who had separated from Prince Andrew only 5 months earlier, delivered what the institution saw as a self-inflicted wound of staggering carelessness. Philip was not, at his core, a man driven by personal pique. He was a man driven by institutional survival. His entire adult life had been an exercise in converting private sacrifice into public service. He had given up his naval career, his name, his nationality, and the predictable comforts of a normal home to stand 2 paces behind a woman he called both his wife and his sovereign. In his mind, nothing mattered except the health and dignity of the crown. When he saw that photograph, he did not see a sexual indiscretion. He saw a bomb thrown into the one thing he had spent 50 years protecting. The fury was real, but the reasoning behind it was strategic. Sarah, by her own chaotic indiscipline, had become a direct threat to the institutional project to which he had devoted his existence. But there is a second layer, one far less examined and far more illuminating. It was not the photograph alone that sealed her fate, it was what she did next. The separation from Andrew became a divorce in 1996, and for a time, Philip might have regarded the whole affair as a closed file, a regrettable chapter from which the family could now move on. What he could not forgive, what turned the freeze from a temporary cooling into a permanent state of exile, was her decision to commercialize the very connection he had spent a lifetime sacrificing for. This is the hidden truth that the celebrity press has never properly understood. Prince Philip's entire identity was built on an unspoken contract. In exchange for a life of extraordinary privilege, he would ask for nothing for himself. He took no salary, he pursued no business ventures, he wrote no tell-all memoirs. When the painter Pietro Annigoni completed his famous portrait of the Duke in 1969, Philip's only comment was that the face looked tired from overwork. That was the kind of man he was. He believed that royalty was, or ought to be, a kind of secular priesthood. You served, you did not profit. Sarah Ferguson, by contrast, had emerged from the divorce with significant debts, and she saw her royal proximity as an asset to be leveraged. It began with a Weight Watchers endorsement in 1997, an American deal that traded on her title and her very public figure. Then came the memoirs, the children's books, the television appearances. But the true moment of sacrilege, from Philip's perspective, occurred in May of 2010. That was when the News of the World set up a sting operation. An undercover reporter posing as a businessman met Sarah in a London hotel room and recorded her offering to open doors to Prince Andrew for the sum of £500,000. The footage, broadcast around the world, showed the Duchess of York smoking, drinking, and apparently selling access to the Queen's own son. For Philip, this was not merely embarrassing, it was a form of treason. Sarah had not just broken trust, she had put a price tag on the institution he considered sacred. One former senior aide, who served in the Duke of Edinburgh's office for over a decade, told a biographer that Philip had reached a point where he could no longer bear even the sound of her name. Not because he despised her with passionate heat, that would have signified some form of emotional investment, but because he had concluded, with what the aide described as the cold finality of a surgeon, that she was a person who merited none of his time. The decision was never announced. It was simply executed across every palace corridor, every family gathering, every Christmas lunch for the next 26 years. Now, to understand how this extraordinary estrangement was physically possible, how 2 people who both spent significant time at Windsor and Balmoral and various family events could simply not meet for over a quarter of a century, we must look at the hidden architecture of royal living. Prince Philip's daily life, in his later years, settled into an unvarying rhythm. After his retirement from public duties in 2017, he spent most of his time at Wood Farm, a modest farmhouse on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk. Sarah, after her divorce, did not have a permanent residence on any royal estate for many years, but that changed in 2008, when she moved into Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park with Prince Andrew. They lived there together, despite their divorce, in a curious arrangement that confounded the tabloids. Royal Lodge is a vast 30-room house originally built as a retreat for King George IV. It sits inside a private area of the park, just 3 miles from Windsor Castle, where the Queen and Philip would often stay on weekends. Now, theoretically, this proximity should have led to regular encounters, but Philip and the Queen did not live in the castle proper when they were at Windsor. They often used a smaller private apartment in the Victoria Tower, and their schedules were managed months in advance. More importantly, Philip had a private secretary, Brigadier Sir Miles Hunt Davis, and a team of equerries whose unspoken duties included what one former staffer called the choreography of distance. I quote from a source who worked at Windsor for 15 years. It was unspoken but absolute. The Duke's path was never to cross the Duchess's. If she was attending a family lunch at the castle, he would arrive earlier and leave in time. If he walked the dogs in the home park, the rangers would check, and I mean physically check, that she was not walking out from Royal Lodge along the same tracks. It was an inversion of normal security. We were not protecting them from threats. We were protecting the Duke from the Duchess. This logistical ballet continued quietly for years. At Balmoral, Sarah was never invited during the Queen's traditional summer stay, even though Prince Andrew often visited with their daughters, Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie. At Sandringham for Christmas, the guest list was a matter of inviolable tradition, and Sarah's name had been struck from it in 1992 and never restored. For Philip, absence was not a punishment, it was a structural condition, designed into the very layout of his life. To grasp why Philip's reaction was so absolute, we must rewind the tape much further than the toe-sucking photograph. We must look at the making of the man himself. Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark was born on a kitchen table on the island of Corfu in 1921 into a dynasty that was crumbling even as he drew his first breath. His father, Prince Andrew, was nearly executed by a Greek revolutionary court. His mother, Princess Alice of Battenberg, descended into severe mental illness and was institutionalized in Switzerland for years. His 4 older sisters married German princes and, after the war, were essentially cut off from him due to their Nazi connections. By the age of 10, Philip had no home, no country, no functioning parents. He was a boy without a family, shuffled between relations in England and Germany, carrying his few belongings in a single trunk. The Royal Navy saved him. It gave him structure, purpose, a ladder to climb. He became a decorated officer, mentioned in dispatches for his bravery during the Battle of Cape Matapan. He was on a trajectory to become First Sea Lord, the professional pinnacle of British naval command. And then, in 1947, he gave it all up to marry Princess Elizabeth. The day he became a British subject, renouncing his Greek and Danish titles, he ceased to be Philip of Greece. He became a royal consort, a role with no constitutional definition and no salary. His uncle, Lord Louis Mountbatten, once crudely remarked that the House of Hanover was about to become the House of Battenberg. But in truth, Philip was absorbed into the Windsors entirely. His children would not bear his surname. His own wife would outrank him in every public setting. How does such a man cope? He builds a fortress of duty. He becomes the most tight-cornered, disciplinarian, unsentimental defender of the institution that took his identity in exchange for a new one. Philip did not talk about sacrifice because he considered the very concept self-indulgent. One simply got on with it. He expected everyone around him to adopt the same code. His daughter, Princess Anne, often cited as the child most like him in temperament, absorbed this lesson perfectly. No complaining, no self-pity, no seeking of public acclaim for what you were supposed to do anyway. And now, into this worldview, walks Sarah Margaret Ferguson. She was the second daughter of Major Ronald Ferguson, the polo manager to Prince Charles, and his first wife, Susan. Her childhood was not as dramatically ruptured as Philip's, but it bore its own wounds. Her mother left when Sarah was 13, running off to Argentina with a professional polo player, a scandal that left the family socially bruised. Sarah came of age in a world of equestrian surfaces and brittle upper-class laughter, a girl who masked her insecurity with loud jokes and big gestures. She was, by all accounts, a breath of fresh air when she first appeared in royal circles, informal, irreverent, fundamentally warm in a way the Windsors often struggled to express. Philip, initially, liked her. This is a crucial detail that often gets lost. During the courtship and early marriage to Prince Andrew, The Duke of Edinburgh apparently found Sarah's unpolished energy amusing. She was not like the gilded, careful aristos who usually surrounded the family. She laughed too loudly. She teased Prince Andrew about his helicopter flying. She wasn't afraid to be seen enjoying herself. In those early days, Philip saw in her a kind of honest vitality that the institution, with its endless protocols and silences, so desperately needed. But the very quality that charmed him initially, her chaotic, unfiltered humanity, was precisely what would later poison the well. Because what Philip wanted was for that energy to be deployed in service of the crown. He imagined, perhaps, that Sarah would bring a modern, relatable face to the monarchy without challenging its fundamental discipline. He did not account for the possibility that her chaos would prove uncontainable, that the same force that made her fun at a dinner party would also make her a target for every tabloid predator, and that when the inevitable crisis came, she would not have the internal architecture of self-sacrifice to fall back on. She would do what so many people do when they fall. She would try to save herself, using the only tools she had. This is the psychological chasm at the heart of the estrangement. Philip saw the institution as a sacred body. Sarah saw it as a family she had married into, a family that, when the marriage failed, still owed her some form of belonging. Philip saw her post-divorce career as a perpetual desecration. Every Weight Watchers commercial, every book deal, every party appearance, another small piece of the crown sold for a check. Sarah, for her part, saw herself as a single mother of two princesses, trying to pay off debts and build a life after the fairy tale had dissolved. She once said, in a moment of rare self-awareness, "I lost my way for a while, but I found it again." Philip, however, had no interest in her finding her way. He had already drawn the map of acceptable royal behaviour, and she had wandered so far off it that she was no longer on the same continent. Now let us populate this drama with the figures who orbited it. There was Prince Andrew himself, the husband who never stopped being her supporter and, oddly, her protector. After the divorce, their relationship transformed into something few outsiders could understand. They continued to live together, travel together, and co-parent with a harmony that baffled the press. Andrew's loyalty to Sarah infuriated Philip on a separate level, because it meant that the son he viewed as a diminished version of himself, a naval officer who never quite achieved the greatness of his father's generation, was now tethered to the very woman Philip wished to expunge. Then there was Princess Anne, who had little time for Sarah from the start, seeing her as a lightweight incapable of the discipline the job demanded. Anne's own marriage to Mark Phillips had crumbled quietly. She had remarried Commander Timothy Lawrence without the world ever invading her privacy. The contrast was not lost on Philip. The Queen Mother, during the final years of her life, occupied an ambiguous position. She was by nature inclined to kindness, and saw the misery behind Sarah's public humiliation. But she was also the guardian of the Windsor mystique, and she never challenged Philip's edict. Courtiers like Sir Robert Fellows, the Queen's private secretary, and also brother-in-law to Princess Diana, navigated the delicate terrain of keeping Sarah away from official events, while never issuing a written ban. Bans leave paper trails, and paper trails become headlines. And the staff, the unnamed nannies, dressers, footmen, and protection officers, became the silent engineers of a policy that had no name. They knew which corridors to avoid. They knew when the Duke was arriving. One of the most poignant witnesses to this prolonged estrangement was Princess Eugenie, Philip's granddaughter and Sarah's younger daughter. Eugenie grew up loving both her mother and her grandfather with fierce devotion. She was often described as the grandchild most emotionally attuned to the old Duke, visiting him at Wood Farm, sharing his love of painting and quiet conversation. She lived with the permanent awareness that her two most beloved relatives could not be in the same room. According to a family friend who spoke to a biographer, Eugenie learned by her early teens to segment her life into compartments that never touched. A day with Granny and Grandpa at the castle, followed by a car ride back to Royal Lodge where her mother waited. Love, in that configuration, became an exercise in careful geometry. And what of Sarah herself during these decades? She did not remain static. She wrote books, many of them bestsellers in the children's and self-help categories. She became a grandmother. She fought a public battle with her own weight and self-image, making her, paradoxically, a figure of some empathetic connection with ordinary women who struggled with similar demons. She sometimes gave interviews in which she referred to the Windsors as the family, with a wistfulness that was unmistakable. She had not been officially exiled from the land, but she had been exiled from the heart of the clan. The pain, for someone so fundamentally sociable, must have been immense. Yet she never publicly attacked Philip. That too was part of the strange discipline of this frieze. She loved Prince Andrew, she loved her daughters, and she had absorbed enough of the royal code to know that a direct assault on the patriarch would only harm them. The frieze held, with one documented and deeply symbolic exception. On the 12th of October, 2018, St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle was filled with autumn light and the assembled ranks of European royalty. Princess Eugenie, the younger daughter, was marrying Jack Brooksbank. The bride walked down the aisle in a gown by Peter Pilotto, designed with a low back to deliberately reveal the scar from her childhood scoliosis surgery, an act of quiet defiance and openness that was entirely in keeping with her mother's spirit. The photographs from that day were pored over by royal watchers, but one image in particular sent ripples through the commentary. It showed the Duke of Edinburgh, then 97 years old and recently recovered from a hip replacement, standing in the chapel, and beside him, for the first time in a quarter century at a formal family event, was Sarah Ferguson. She was not beside him for long, and the photograph captured a careful arrangement. Philip looked directly at the camera with the faint, inscrutable expression he had perfected over decades, a half smile that could mean anything from amusement to forbearance. Sarah, in a navy blue ensemble, appeared composed but not triumphant. This was not a reconciliation. It was a one-day armistice, a grandfather's gift to a granddaughter he adored. The wall that had stood since 1992 was lowered for the length of a wedding service and a reception, and then, by all accounts, it went back up. Eugenie had managed what no amount of public relations could, a brief, humane exception. But an exception, by its nature, proves the rule it suspends. The fifth act of this story is a catalogue of consequences, some public, some painfully private. The most immediate and enduring consequence was a schism within the York family dynamic that forced everyone to navigate around a void. Prince Andrew, already a diminished figure in public life after his own catastrophic errors, found himself in the impossible position of being the hinge between two worlds that could not meet. His loyalty to Sarah, in many ways admirable on a human level, only deepened his father's disappointment. Philip had always been hard on Andrew. The Duke's biographers record a relationship marked by impatience and a certain bewilderment that the son had inherited none of the father's relentless drive. Andrew's steadfast refusal to abandon Sarah, indeed his insistence on cohabiting with her, became another data point in Philip's private ledger of family failings. For the Queen, the situation created a subtle but persistent tension. She was the sovereign, the ultimate arbiter of the family's public face, but she was also a wife who understood her husband's rigidity and a grandmother who wanted peace. Those who knew her well say she operated on a principle of quietism. She would not overrule Philip, but she also would not make a public spectacle of the estrangement. When Sarah was not invited to state banquets or Order of the Garter ceremonies, the official line was always that the guest list was drawn up according to traditional criteria. Nobody ever said, "Because the Duke of Edinburgh will not have her present." They did not need to. Another consequence, more positive, was that the frieze may have inadvertently protected Sarah from the worst institutional storms. When Prince Andrew's own scandals erupted with full force after the Jeffrey Epstein revelations, and his public life was terminated in 2019, Sarah stood somewhat apart. She had already been cast out, and so the blowback did not land on her with the same concentrated force. The daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, inherited a kind of resilience from living in the intermediate space. They learned diplomacy, boundary management, and emotional intelligence from a young age because their very existence demanded it. But the most profound consequence was a silence that stretched for decades. At no point in those 26 years did Philip and Sarah have a single recorded private conversation aimed at understanding or closure. There was no deathbed apology, no letter of forgiveness found in a drawer after Philip's death. The absence was absolute. When Sarah gave an interview shortly after the Duke's passing in April 2021, she spoke of him with a careful, measured warmth, calling him a great man, and noting that they had shared the joy of seeing their grandchildren together. But she also said, with a slight quiver in her voice that the transcript cannot convey, "I think he would have been very proud of the way the family has come together." The conditional tense, "he would have been," spoke volumes. She was describing a hypothetical man, not the one who had shut her out. We come now to the final ironic turn. Philip's funeral took place on the 17th of April, 2021, in the same St. George's Chapel that had hosted Eugenie's wedding. COVID restrictions limited attendance to 30 people, a tiny number for a man with a vast network of relations and godchildren. The guest list became a matter of excruciating scrutiny. Many expected Sarah to be excluded, a final posthumous snub from a man who refused to bend. The Daily Mail ran speculative pieces about whether she would even be allowed near the grounds. The truth was far simpler and, in its way, more touching. Sarah's exclusion from the funeral was not a personal directive from beyond the grave. It was a matter of public health regulation. 30 people, arranged in household bubbles, chosen according to strict pandemic rules. The official list included the Queen, the 4 children and their spouses, the 8 grandchildren, plus a few key relatives like Princess Margaret's children and a representative of Philip's German family. Even Philip's closest living aide, Brigadier Archie Miller Bakewell, barely made the cut. In that brutal arithmetic, a former daughter-in-law, however connected, however geographically proximate, simply had no place. In the days after the funeral, several royal commentators, including the historian Hugo Vickers and the biographer Penny Junor, noted the sad symmetry. The man who had spent 3 decades engineering her absence from his orbit had now, by a quirk of a global pandemic, achieved the same result from his coffin. The irony was exquisite and entirely unintended. Sarah watched the service on television, alone, like millions of others. The photograph that emerged in the days following showed her walking her dogs near Royal Lodge, looking pensive. The frieze had ended not with a thaw, but with an event so large and impersonal that it rendered personal grievances irrelevant. But here is the detail that has never left me, the small, specific fact that encapsulates the entire story. In the months after Philip's death, Sarah was finally permitted, by circumstance, by the Queen's own weary acceptance of a difficult situation, to visit the private chapel at Windsor Great Park on a regular basis. She began attending small, informal services where she had previously been unwelcome. According to a royal correspondent who has covered the beat for 20 years, she was seen one Sunday morning, in early autumn, laying a small posy of wildflowers on a bench where Philip used to sit and read his newspapers. She did not announce this. She told no one. It was a private gesture, made by a woman to a man who would not have accepted it if he were alive. Whether it was an act of forgiveness, of defiance, or simply of private mourning, we cannot know. That image captures the entire tragedy. Philip built a fortress of principle so high that even death could not dismantle it in his lifetime. Sarah, for all her mistakes, was never intentionally malicious. She was chaotic, hungry for love, and ill-suited to the cage she had entered. The real villain, if we must find one, is the institution itself, a system that demands total subsumption of the self and punishes human frailty with silent, permanent exile. Prince Philip was its most faithful servant, and Sarah Ferguson was its most conspicuous casualty. I am Arthur Blackwood, and you have been listening to The Royal Archivist. If you believe the hidden histories of these houses deserve a deeper look, do subscribe to this channel and ring the bell so the next dispatch finds its way to you. Until then, I remain, as ever, your servant in the archives.